Play something worth listening to, and I'll adopt you." He called the boy talentless and dangled adoption like a joke. 1 minute later, the first note hit, and every smile in the room died. By the time the music ended, the billionaire knew he'd made a mistake he couldn't buy his way out of. The offer was meant to humiliate him. Play well or lose everything. But the second the boy began, something shifted. Phones dropped, laughter vanished, and the power flipped. What happens when the weakest kid becomes the most dangerous person in the room? They expected noise, mistakes, embarrassment. Instead, the boy played truth, and it cut deeper than anyone was ready for. By the final note, one question hung in the air. Who was really being tested here? This is the story of how one performance, just one honest piece of music, can expose every lie a room full of elites has ever told themselves about talent, worth, and what it means to truly see another human being. Before you leave, let me ask you something. Did this story make you feel something? Did it make you think, cry, hope, or believe in real and hidden talent again? If the answer is yes, then I need you to do something for me. Actually, do something for you. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Tap the like so I know this resonated, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And do not forget to let me know in the comments where you are watching from. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Ashford Music Hall, catching the dust motes that danced above the polished grand piano. Everything in this room cost more than most families earned in a year. The chandeliers, the imported marble floors, the chairs upholstered in fabric woven in Italy. Sebastian Patrick stood beside that piano like he owned it, which, technically, he did. At 59, he owned a lot of things: buildings, companies, politicians' gratitude. His silver hair was styled with the kind of casual precision that required a personal barber. His navy suit probably cost what the Don Bosco Youth Center spent feeding children for a month. In front of him, arranged in an uncomfortable line, stood 7 children clutching instruments that seemed too large for their small hands. They'd been brought here for what the invitation had called a charity showcase, a chance to perform for potential donors, a chance to be seen. Curtis Denvar was at the end of that line, smallest of them all. 10 years old, but looked younger. His sweater had been mended so many times the elbows showed patches on patches. His shoes, donated clearly, were tied with mismatched laces. His dark eyes were wide, but not with the nervous excitement the other children showed. Please, hit that subscribe button. Smash the like button and share this story to show your support for this channel. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story. Curtis's eyes held something else entirely. Something patient. Something that had learned to wait. The other children had already performed. Caitlin had played her violin with technical precision. Every note correct and lifeless. Robin had attacked his trumpet with enthusiasm that couldn't quite hide his shaky embouchure. Abel and Paul had stumbled through a duet that made the adults wince politely. Gerald had delivered a memorized piece perfectly, robotically, like he was checking boxes on an assignment. Polite applause had followed each performance. Polite smiles. Polite encouragement that meant nothing. Sebastian Patrick had grown visibly bored. Now there was only Curtis left. "Well," Patrick said, his voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they're about to say something they find amusing. "This is the one they told me about. The one with—" He paused, smile widening. "The least talent." Several guests chuckled. Victoria Dean, Patrick's executive assistant, touched his arm gently, a gesture that said, maybe that's too far, but he brushed her off. Curtis stood there, hands at his sides, looking at the piano bench like it was a long distance away. Patrick crossed his arms, enjoying his audience now. A few people had their phones out, sensing something interesting was about to happen. "I'll tell you what, Curtis. You come up here, you sit down, you play me something actually worth listening to, and if you can impress me." He gestured broadly at the room, at himself, at the life his money had built. "I'll adopt you, give you a real home, real education, everything you don't have." The room went silent. Victoria's eyes widened. A woman in the front row gasped softly. Patrick's smile turned sharp. "But when you fail, and Curtis, let's be honest, you will fail, you never show your face here again, not at this hall, not at any event I sponsor, not anywhere near my foundation. Are we clear?" Curtis looked at him for a long moment. The other children had turned to watch. Caitlin gripping her violin, Robin's mouth slightly open, Gerald staring at the floor like he wished he could disappear. "Do you want to play?" Patrick asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer, already knew how this would end. Curtis walked to the piano bench. His feet barely reached the pedals. He placed his small hands on the keys, fingers settling into position with a familiarity that looked almost like muscle memory. Behind him, the room held its breath. Patrick leaned against the piano's edge, already half turned away. Already thinking about the story he'd tell at dinner later, about the charity case who'd frozen under pressure. "Whenever you're ready," he said dismissively. Curtis took one breath, then another, and then he began. But to understand what happened next, to understand why those first notes landed like a blow to everyone who heard them, you have to go back. Back to before the music hall, before Sebastian Patrick's cruel offer, before Curtis became the boy no one noticed. You have to go back to Don Bosco Youth Center, where Curtis Denvar had spent the last 3 years learning the most important lesson of his life: how to disappear. Before we proceed, make sure to click the subscribe button and share this story to people in your circle. Don Bosco Youth Center occupied a converted school building on the east side, where the city's promise of renewal always seemed to stop, just 1 block short. The building was old but clean, maintained by caretakers who did their best with limited resources and unlimited need. Curtis Denvar had arrived 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in September, holding a social worker's hand and carrying everything he owned in a garbage bag. He was 7 years old. He didn't cry. He'd learned by then that crying changed nothing. The youth center housed 43 children at any given time. Some stayed for months, others for years. A few, like Curtis, had nowhere else to go. There was an order to things at Don Bosco, an invisible hierarchy the adults pretended didn't exist, but every child understood perfectly. Caitlin Morrison was at the top, 12 years old, blonde hair, always in a neat ponytail. Violin case carried like a badge of honor. She'd been accepted to the pre-conservatory program at the Chicago Academy of Arts. Donors loved her. She had what the caretakers called presentation, which meant she looked good in the fundraising brochures and knew how to smile on cue. Robin Martinez came next, 11, loud, confident in the way children are when they've learned that volume equals visibility. His trumpet playing was sloppy, but he had stage presence. He made people laugh. That counted for something. Then Abel and Paul Chen, 9-year-old twins who did everything together, spoke in half sentences the other finished, and played piano duets that were technically proficient, but utterly forgettable. Gerald Thompson was 10, like Curtis, but Gerald had something Curtis didn't. A grandmother who visited every Sunday, who brought cookies and promised she was working on getting custody back, who gave him a reason to practice hard and dream of leaving. And then there was Curtis. Curtis, who spoke so rarely that new caretakers sometimes thought he was selectively mute. Curtis, who ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. Curtis, who never asked for anything, never caused problems, never made himself memorable in any way. Curtis had learned early that invisible children were safe children. They didn't get picked for the special outings and then forgotten. They didn't get their hopes raised by potential adoptive families who decided they wanted a different child, a younger one, an easier one, a child who looked more like what they'd imagined. Invisible children didn't get hurt as often. The music program at Don Bosco was run by Mrs. Breathtaking Eleanor Hartley, a retired teacher with kind eyes and arthritic hands who believed music could save troubled children. She wasn't wrong, exactly, but she operated on assumptions Curtis had learned to recognize. Talent was obvious. Genius announced itself, and children who hung back were simply shy. During rehearsals, Mrs. Hartley focused on Caitlin's vibrato, Robin's breath support, the twins' synchronization. She'd pause by Curtis's piano bench, pat his shoulder, and say things like, "Just keep trying, dear," or "You're improving," in that particular tone adults use when they don't actually believe what they're saying. Curtis had been playing piano since he was 4 years old. His mother, before the accident, before everything fell apart, had been teaching him. Not children's songs or simplified arrangements, but real music, theory, composition, the architecture of sound. But at Don Bosco, Curtis played badly on purpose. He missed notes during group rehearsals, let his timing drift, played with mechanical correctness that erased any hint of feeling. He watched Mrs. Hartley's expectations lower with each session, watched her attention shift more fully to the children she believed she could help. It was safer that way. The other children mostly ignored him. Caitlin found him boring. Robin thought he was weird. The twins existed in their own world. Gerald was kind enough, but they'd never formed a real friendship. Gerald had his grandmother, his future. Curtis had learned not to attach himself to people who were leaving. But at night, when the youth center settled into its after-lights-out quiet, Curtis became someone else entirely. He would slip out of the boys' dormitory, 8 beds crammed into a room meant for 4, and make his way down the hall to the music room. Mrs. Hartley never locked it, believing that instruments should be accessible to children who wanted to practice. Curtis wanted to practice, just not the way anyone expected. In the darkness, with only the streetlight filtering through the old windows, Curtis would sit at the upright piano and listen, not to music, to everything else. The building creaking as the heat cycled through ancient pipes. The rhythm of it, irregular but patterned. The sound of Robin grinding his teeth in his sleep 3 doors down. The way the traffic outside changed between midnight and 3 a.m., from purposeful to desperate. The crying that came sometimes from the girl's wing. Different children. Same sound of loss. Curtis listened to the world the way other people read books, and then he'd translate it, not into the classical pieces Mrs. Hartley assigned, but into something else, something that captured the feeling of waiting for morning, the sound of hoping for something you couldn't name, the melody of being small in a world that didn't see you. He filled notebook after notebook with compositions he never showed anyone. Music that had no names because the feelings they expressed had no names either. When dawn started to gray the windows, Curtis would return to his bed. The other boys never woke. Curtis moved through the world like a ghost, leaving no trace. During the day, he played Mozart badly. At night, he played himself perfectly. The rehearsals for Sebastian Patrick's showcase had been disaster after disaster. Curtis had fumbled through Furelise with timing so poor that Mrs. Hartley had actually winced. She'd suggested maybe he should sit this one out, let the more advanced students represent Don Bosco. Curtis had nodded, agreeable as always, but then Caitlin had said something, just a casual comment, while rosining her bow. "I heard Mr. Patrick only invited us because his foundation needs the tax write-off. He doesn't actually care about any of this." Curtis had looked up from the piano keys. "Then why are we going?" "Because Mrs. Hartley thinks exposure is good for us," Gerald had answered, not unkindly. "Even if we're just there to make rich people feel charitable." That night, Curtis had sat at the piano until his fingers ached. Not practicing Für Elise, not practicing anything anyone would expect. He played the piece he'd been composing for 3 years, the one that started the night he'd arrived at Don Bosco with a garbage bag and no family. The piece that had grown and changed as he'd grown, as the building's rhythms had become his rhythms, as waiting had become his life. He played what it felt like to be 7 years old and know no one was coming for you. What it felt like to be 8 and realize that was okay. What it felt like to be 9 and decide that maybe invisibility was a kind of power. What it felt like to be 10 and understand that one day you might choose to be seen, but only on your terms. The piece had no name. It didn't need one. When Sebastian Patrick had made his offer in that music hall, Curtis had known immediately what he would play. Not because he wanted to be adopted, not because he believed Patrick's promise meant anything, but because for once, just once, Curtis wanted someone to hear him, really hear him. Not the shy, struggling boy everyone assumed he was, but the person he actually was when no one was watching. The person who listened to the world and understood its music. The person who'd been waiting patiently for the exact right moment to stop being invisible. That moment, Curtis decided as his hands settled on the keys in Sebastian Patrick's elegant music hall, was now. Sebastian Patrick had been poor once, though he rarely admitted it, and never in public. Not homeless poor or hungry poor, just ordinary suburban poverty. The kind where your father worked 2 jobs and your mother clipped coupons. Where you wore your older brother's hand-me-downs and knew better than to ask for the expensive sneakers the other kids wore. He'd escaped it through brilliance and ruthlessness in equal measure. Full scholarship to Northwestern, top of his class, investment banking by 25, his own firm by 32, real estate empire by 40. By 50, Sebastian Patrick was the kind of wealthy where money became abstract, where numbers on screens represented power rather than actual things you could touch. He'd earned every dollar. That's what he told himself, what he told everyone. And because he'd earned it, he understood something most people didn't. Excellence announced itself. Talent was obvious. Winners revealed themselves immediately, and losers made excuses. His office occupied the top floor of Patrick Tower, all glass and steel, and a view of Lake Michigan that cost more per square foot than most people's mortgages. The walls displayed his collection, Rothko, Pollock, a small Basquiat he'd acquired at auction for an amount that made headlines. Art was investment. Culture was portfolio diversification. Beauty was something you owned. Victoria Chen had worked for Sebastian for 8 years. She managed his calendar, his charitable foundation, his public image. She was good at her job because she understood what he needed before he asked for it. But lately, she'd been pushing back. "The Don Bosco showcase," she'd said 3 weeks before the event, standing in his office with a tablet full of details. "I've reviewed the children's files. Some of them have been in the system for years. Real trauma, real challenges. Maybe we should approach this differently." Sebastian had looked up from the contract he was reviewing. Differently how? Less performative. Maybe private meetings, actual mentorship programs, sustained support instead of a one-time event. He'd smiled the way he smiled when subordinates suggested things that revealed they didn't understand how power actually worked. "Victoria, we donate 6 figures annually to youth arts programs. The foundation gala raised $2.3 million last year. I think we're doing our part." "I know, but these events create opportunity. The children get exposure. Donors feel good. Everyone wins. That's how charity works." What he didn't say, what he never had to say because Victoria already knew, it was also how tax deductions worked, how positive press worked, how you maintained the kind of reputation that opened doors and closed deals. Philanthropy was smart business. Anyone who thought otherwise was naive. The morning of the showcase, Sebastian had breakfast with Marcus Wellesley, a venture capitalist whose opinion actually mattered. They met at the Metropolitan Club, where the coffee cost $18 and came with a view of ordinary people rushing to ordinary jobs. "You're really doing the orphan concert thing?" Marcus had asked, amused. "Youth Center children," Sebastian corrected. "And yes, it's good optics. The foundation board likes visible projects." "Find any prodigies in the bunch?" Sebastian had laughed. "You know what I've learned, Marcus? Real talent is unmistakable. Yo-Yo Ma didn't need to be discovered. His genius was obvious from childhood. Itzhak Perlman, Lang Lang, all the greats. They announce themselves. And the ones who don't announce themselves? They're not hiding genius. They're just ordinary." Sebastian had cut into his eggs Benedict with the precision he brought to everything. People love the narrative of hidden potential, the diamond in the rough, but that's mostly sentimental nonsense. Excellence is excellent. Mediocrity is mediocre. The difference is usually obvious if you're willing to see it. Marcus had raised his coffee cup in agreement. "That's why you're where you are, Sebastian. You don't waste time on maybes." That conversation had been playing in Sebastian's mind when he'd arrived at the Ashford Music Hall that afternoon. Victoria had assembled the children in the green room, nervous and small, in their donated dress clothes. Sebastian had watched them through the door's window before entering. The blonde girl, Caitlin, held herself like someone who expected to be noticed. The boy with the trumpet, Robin, was making the others laugh, commanding attention through sheer volume. The twins moved in synchronization, finishing each other's sentences. And then there was the small one, Curtis, sitting apart, hands folded in his lap, eyes distant. Victoria had pulled him aside. "That's Curtis Denvar. He's been at Don Bosco for 3 years. His file says he's been studying music since he was very young, but he struggles during rehearsals. Mrs. Hartley thinks he has performance anxiety." "Or he's just not very good," Sebastian had suggested. "Sebastian, it's not cruel to acknowledge reality, Victoria. Some children have talent, some don't. Better they learn that early than waste years chasing something they'll never achieve." He'd meant it kindly, honestly. Better to be honest than to fill a child's head with false hope. The showcase had proceeded exactly as expected. The blonde girl played well, technically proficient, proper training evident. The trumpet boy had enthusiasm. The twins were adequate. The quiet one, Gerald, had memorized his piece competently enough. Polite applause. Polite smiles. Exactly what everyone anticipated. And then there was just Curtis left. Sebastian had noticed during rehearsal that morning how the boy fumbled through his piece, missing notes, losing timing. Mrs. Hartley had actually apologized for including him. "He tries so hard," she'd said, "but I'm afraid he's just not at the level of the others." Now, standing in the music hall with donors watching, Sebastian had felt something click into place. An opportunity, a teachable moment. This was the perfect example of what he'd been telling Marcus. Here was a child who clearly didn't have what it took. Better to be honest now. Better to show him, kindly, publicly, where he stood in the world's hierarchy of talent. The adoption offer had come to him spontaneously, but it felt right. Generous, even. If by some miracle the boy could actually play, Sebastian would genuinely help him. But when he couldn't, and he couldn't, obviously, at least Curtis would understand reality. Some people were meant to lead, others to follow. That's just how the world worked. Victoria's hand on his arm had been a warning. He'd ignored it. The other adults in the room might have their sentimental notions about children and potential, but Sebastian Patrick had built an empire by seeing things clearly. He saw Curtis clearly now. A small boy, poorly dressed, obviously limited. Probably kind. Probably earnest. But ultimately ordinary. The cruel offer everyone would later call it? Sebastian saw it differently. He was offering the boy dignity through honesty. Better to fail now, in a room that would forget him by tomorrow, than to spend years chasing a dream that would never materialize. Victoria would understand eventually. They all would. As Curtis walked to the piano bench, feet barely reaching the pedals, Sebastian had already turned half away. This would take 2 minutes, maybe 3. Then they could move on to the reception, where actual donors waited to write actual checks. He checked his watch. 4:47 p.m. Behind him, Curtis's hands settled on the keys. Sebastian barely noticed. He was already thinking about his dinner reservation, about the Rothko he was considering for the lobby, about everything except the small boy who'd been saving his truth for exactly this moment. "Whenever you're ready," he'd said dismissively. 3 weeks earlier, in that same office with the million-dollar view, Sebastian had told Victoria, "Save the weakest performer for last. Get the quality out first. End on a practical note about how not everyone has what it takes. It'll make the successful ones look even better by contrast." Victoria had hesitated. "That seems strategic," Sebastian had finished. "It's strategic, and it's honest." Now, in the music hall, with Curtis's hands on the keys and the room holding its breath, Sebastian Patrick believed he'd orchestrated the perfect demonstration of his philosophy. Talent was obvious. Excellence announced itself. And this small, quiet boy was about to prove him absolutely right. He had no idea he'd already lost. The afternoon had the quality of a performance everyone was enduring rather than enjoying. Sebastian Patrick stood near the front of the assembled guests. 27 donors, board members, and carefully selected press. His expression arranged in what he considered an appropriately supportive smile. Behind that smile, his mind was already somewhere else. A merger that needed his attention. The Basquiat's placement in the tower lobby. Anything but this. Mrs. Hartley stood nervously by the piano, hands clasped, introducing each child with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that made Patrick's teeth ache. "Our first performer is Caitlin Morrison, who will be playing Vivaldi's concerto in a minor, first movement." Caitlin stepped forward, violin tucked under her chin with textbook precision. She was 12, but carried herself older. Blonde hair in a ponytail so tight it looked painful. Her dress was donated but pressed. Her shoes shined. Everything about her said, "I am trying very hard to be what you want me to be." She began. The notes were correct. Technically, impeccably correct. Each measure executed with the kind of precision that came from hours of drilling. Her posture was perfect, back straight, elbow at exactly the right angle, bow moving in smooth, controlled strokes. But there was nothing there. No joy, no sorrow, no anger, no yearning. Just notes following notes in their proper order, like a competent machine fulfilling its programming. Patrick glanced around the room. Polite attention, a few people checking phones discreetly. The board president, Margaret Chen, Victoria's mother, and a woman whose opinion actually mattered, had the glazed expression of someone thinking about their grocery list. Caitlin finished. The last note hung in the air for the appropriate length of time. She'd been coached well on that. And then she lowered her violin. Applause. Polite, proper applause that said absolutely nothing. "Lovely, dear," Patrick said, his voice carrying the particular tone of adults who don't want to discourage children but also don't want to lie. "Very precise. You've clearly worked hard." Caitlin's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She understood what precise meant when it was the only compliment offered. She'd heard it before. Mrs. Hartley rushed to fill the silence. "Caitlin has been accepted to the pre-conservatory program at the Chicago Academy of Arts. She's one of only 15 students selected this year." More applause. Slightly warmer now. Achievement was something these people understood. Patrick nodded approvingly. This was what success looked like. Obvious, measurable, the kind of thing you could put on a resume. "Wonderful," he said. "That's the kind of dedication we love to support." Next, Ruben Martinez bounded forward with his trumpet before Mrs. Hartley could properly introduce him. 11 years old, all energy and angles, wearing a tie that was already coming loose. Where Caitlin had been controlled, Ruben was explosion. "I'm going to play When the Saints Go Marching In," he announced, not waiting for permission. He launched into it immediately. Bold, brassy, loud enough that several people in the front row actually leaned back. The tune was recognizable, barely, but his technique was a disaster. His embouchure kept shifting. His timing wandered. Notes cracked and split. But God, he played with feeling. Every note seemed to mean something to him, even if he couldn't quite get his instrument to express what he was hearing in his head. Patrick found it exhausting. "Very enthusiastic," he said, when Ruben finally, mercifully finished. The boy was breathing hard, face flushed, grinning like he'd just conquered Everest. "You've certainly got spirit. With more training, more discipline, you might really develop that raw energy into something refined." The message was clear. You're not there yet. Maybe you never will be. Ruben's grin dimmed slightly. He returned to the line of children, trumpet hanging loose at his side. Abel and Paul Chen came next, moving in their characteristic synchronization. 9 years old, identical down to the way they parted their hair, they settled at the piano bench side by side. Mrs. Hartley had arranged for them to perform a simplified version of a Chopin duet. They played like two machines attempting communication. Technically adequate, properly synchronized, utterly forgettable. Paul watched Abel's hands for cues. Abel watched the sheet music with laser focus. Neither seemed to actually hear the music they were creating. When they finished, they stood in unison and bowed in unison, and Patrick couldn't tell if it was rehearsed or just how they existed in the world. "Nicely done, boys," he said, already forgetting what they'd played. "Good teamwork." Margaret Chen leaned over to whisper in his ear. "Sebastian, this is excruciating. How many more?" "2," he whispered back. "Almost done." The room's energy was dropping with each performance. What had started as polite attention had curdled into obligation. People shifted in their seats. Someone's phone buzzed and wasn't immediately silenced. The spring afternoon outside the tall windows looked increasingly attractive compared to the stifled air inside. Mrs. Hartley seemed to sense it too. Her introduction of Gerald Thompson was faster, more nervous. Gerald will be playing Beethoven's Für Elise. Gerald was 10, thin, with careful eyes that took everything in. Unlike the others, he didn't seem to be performing for the adults. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench with methodical precision, and began. And he was good. Actually good. The familiar melody emerged not just correctly, but with something approaching genuine interpretation. His dynamics shifted purposefully. His phrasing showed thought. This wasn't just memorization. This was a child who'd actually considered what the music meant. For the first time that afternoon, Patrick paid attention. Gerald played the entire piece without a single mistake. Every note landed exactly where it should. The final measures faded with real control, real intention. The applause was warmer, genuine. Several people actually looked impressed. "Now that," Patrick said, and he meant it, "was excellent. Really, truly well done." "How long have you been studying?" 3 years, sir," Gerald said quietly. "My grandmother helps me practice." "It shows. That's the difference, ladies and gentlemen." Patrick turned to address the room, sensing a teaching moment. Real dedication, real practice, real results. This is what's possible when talent meets discipline. Gerald's face flushed with pride and something else. Relief, maybe. The relief of meeting expectations, of being enough. Mrs. Hartley was beaming. Finally, one of her children had delivered what this room wanted. But Patrick's attention was already drifting again. Gerald had been good, competent, even impressive for his age. But nothing transcendent. Nothing that made Patrick feel anything beyond mild approval. Just another well-trained child executing well-taught lessons. The bar had been raised slightly, then immediately forgotten. "Is that everyone?" Margaret Chen asked hopefully. "One more," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice noticeably less enthusiastic. "Curtis will play for us." Patrick saw him then, still standing at the end of the line, small, silent, looking at nothing in particular with those wide, dark eyes. The boy who'd fumbled through rehearsal that morning. The boy Mrs. Hartley had apologized for including. The boy who represented everything Patrick had been explaining to Marcus over breakfast. Not everyone had what it took, and it was kinder to acknowledge that than pretend otherwise. "Ah, yes," Patrick said, his voice carrying that particular tone again, the one that pretended to be encouraging but was actually dismissive. "Curtis, the one we saved for last." A few people chuckled. They understood what "saved for last" meant in this context. It meant lowest expectations. It meant, let's get this over with. Victoria touched his arm again, harder this time, a warning that felt more urgent. Patrick ignored it. He was doing the boy a favor. Better to fail here quickly than to harbor false hopes that would only hurt more later. "Come on up, Curtis," he said, gesturing to the piano Gerald had just vacated. "Let's see what you've got." The room had gone quiet. but it was a different quality of quiet than before Gerald's performance. This was the silence of people checking out, of attention already moving elsewhere. The emotional temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Curtis walked to the piano bench slowly, so slowly. Patrick checked his watch again. 4:52 p.m. This would be over in 5 minutes. Then the reception. Then drinks. Then he could forget this entire afternoon. Curtis sat down, arranged his hands on the keys, didn't look at anyone. "Whenever you're ready," Patrick said, already half-turned toward Margaret to continue their earlier conversation about the Foundation's quarterly report. His tone said everything. Let's get this over with. He had no idea Curtis had been waiting 3 years for exactly those words. Curtis's right hand touched middle C. One note, simple, pure, held for exactly 3 beats. Then silence, then the note again, softer this time, like a question being asked twice, hoping for a different answer. Patrick turned back toward Margaret, already forming the words about the quarterly projections, when he heard someone in the 3rd row sigh, not a sigh of appreciation, a sigh of impatience, of "here we go." Curtis played another note, D, uis. Then E, ascending slowly, almost painfully slowly, each note given space to breathe, to exist, to fade, before the next one arrived. It sounded like a child picking out notes one at a time. Tentative, uncertain. Exactly what everyone expected from the boy who'd fumbled through rehearsal. Mrs. Hartley's face had gone tight with sympathetic embarrassment. She was already preparing her intervention, the kind words she'd say to stop this before it became too painful to watch. Patrick's posture shifted into something that looked supportive, but felt like tolerance. He crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the piano's side. His expression said, "I'm giving you time, but don't waste it." In the line of children, Caitlin looked at the floor. Robin shifted his weight from foot to foot. The twins had identical expressions of second-hand discomfort. Only Gerald watched Curtis directly, his face unreadable. Curtis's left hand joined in. A single bass note, low and steady, like a heartbeat. Slow, deliberate. Then another and another. The rhythm was simple, almost primitive. Bass notes marking time, while the right hand continued its slow, exploratory melody. Still, just single notes. Still moving at that glacial pace that made people want to urge him faster, to get to the point, to do something. "Is he actually going somewhere with this?" someone whispered in the back row. Patrick's jaw tightened. He'd given the boy a chance, more than fair. But this was becoming awkward for everyone. Maybe he should stop it now. Save Curtis the humiliation of... The melody changed. Not louder, not faster, but deeper, somehow. Curtis's right hand had moved down the keyboard, finding notes that resonated with the bass line his left hand was still maintaining. The two hands began to create something more than their separate parts. Not harmony, exactly, but conversation. Question and answer. Call and response. The melody began to take shape. Not a recognizable tune. Nothing from the classical repertoire these people expected. But something that had structure, intention, a sense of going somewhere specific, even if that destination wasn't yet clear. Patrick found himself actually listening instead of just waiting for it to end. The music was telling a story. He could feel it even if he couldn't name what the story was. Something about spaces between things, about waiting. About the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who don't see you. Curtis's hands moved across the keys with more confidence now, though his eyes were still closed, his body still small on the bench. The tempo picked up slightly, not much, but enough to feel like forward motion, like something was building. In the audience, people had stopped checking their phones. Margaret Chen's expression had shifted from polite boredom to something more attentive. Confused, maybe, but attentive. Caitlin looked up from the floor, her perfect posture sagging slightly as she watched Curtis's hands. Robin had gone completely still. The twins were leaning forward, identical expressions of concentration on their identical faces. Gerald's eyes had filled with something that looked like recognition. The music began to branch. Curtis's right hand introduced a second melodic line that wove around the first, not competing with it, but complementing it. The left hand's steady heartbeat rhythm remained, grounding everything. But now there were layers, complexity emerging from what had seemed like simplicity. This was not a beginner's piece. Patrick straightened, his arms uncrossing. He took a step closer to the piano without realizing he was moving. The melody carried feeling now, not just technical proficiency, but actual emotion. Curiosity first, gentle and tentative. Then something darker. Fear, maybe, or the anticipation of disappointment. The kind of feeling a child learns when promises are made and then quietly forgotten. But then the melody shifted again. Something warm entered it. Not happiness exactly, more like the memory of happiness. Like a child remembering what home felt like before it stopped being home. Like someone holding on to hope, not because they believe in it, but because letting go would mean admitting something too painful to acknowledge. Mrs. Hartley's hand had moved to her mouth. Her eyes were wide. "Where did he learn this?" Victoria whispered. But Patrick didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. This wasn't memorization. This wasn't something Curtis had learned from a teacher or copied from a recording. This was something else entirely. The music built, still not loud, still controlled, but with increasing complexity. Curtis's hands moved faster now, more confidently, covering more of the keyboard. His right hand climbed higher, finding notes in the upper register that sparkled like light through water, while his left hand introduced a walking bass line that gave everything forward momentum. Jazz harmonies began to appear, unexpected in a piece that had started so simply. Seventh chords, ninths, notes that shouldn't work together, but somehow did. Classical structure bent just slightly, not broken, but flexed, made more interesting. The audience leaned forward collectively, unconsciously. Patrick felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not quite discomfort, but close. The feeling of having assumed something and discovering you were wrong. The feeling of having been so certain, so absolutely certain, and finding the ground shifting beneath your certainty. In the line of children, something remarkable was happening. Caitlin had lowered her violin, holding it slack in one hand, her perfect posture completely abandoned as she stared at Curtis. Her face showed something Patrick had never seen in her before. Genuine feeling. Wonder, maybe. Or envy. Or the painful realization that all her technical precision meant nothing compared to whatever this was. Robin's mouth was open, his trumpet forgotten. The bold, loud boy had gone completely silent. The twins had moved closer together, not consciously, but as if they needed each other to process what they were hearing. They weren't watching Curtis's hands anymore. They were just listening. Gerald's eyes were closed now, his face turned slightly upward. Silent tears ran down his cheeks, and Patrick couldn't tell if they were sad tears or something else. Recognition, maybe. The feeling of finally hearing something true after months of hearing things that were merely correct. The melody climbed higher, became more urgent. Curtis's hands were moving with real purpose now, real command. Every fumble from the morning rehearsal suddenly made sense. They hadn't been mistakes. They'd been experiments, testing, exploring, finding exactly which notes didn't work, so he'd know for certain which ones did. Patrick's hands had loosened at his sides. The dismissive posture was gone. He was just standing there now, a man who'd thought he knew everything about music and talent, and what mattered, being slowly, methodically proven wrong by a 10-year-old boy with scuffed shoes and a frayed sweater. The music shifted again, minor to major, darkness to light. Not all at once. Gradual, like dawn, like the moment when night starts to lose its hold and you can see shapes emerging from shadow. Hope. That's what it sounded like. Not naive hope, not childish optimism, but the deeper kind. The kind you choose despite everything. The kind that survives. And then Curtis introduced something that made Patrick's breath catch. Complexity. Real, sophisticated, undeniable complexity. His right hand split into two distinct voices, melody and counter-melody, moving in conversation with each other. His left hand had abandoned the simple heartbeat rhythm for something more intricate, arpeggios that cascaded up and down, providing harmonic foundation while also contributing their own melodic interest. This was not something a struggling student played. This was not something a child with the least talent could do. This was mastery. And Curtis was just getting started. Curtis's hands moved like they were having a conversation, only they understood. The classical foundation was there, the structure, the theory, the architectural precision of centuries of composition. But layered over it, woven through it, was something that belonged to a different tradition entirely. Jazz inflections, blue notes that bent just slightly sharp, creating tension that resolved in unexpected ways, syncopation that played against the steady pulse, making the rhythm breathe and swing. It shouldn't have worked. Classical and jazz existed in different worlds, spoke different languages, followed different rules. Except Curtis wasn't following rules. He was telling the truth. In the third row, Thomas Brennan sat forward suddenly. He was a music theory professor at DePaul University, attending today as a favor to Margaret Chen. He'd been prepared to endure an afternoon of enthusiastic mediocrity. He was not prepared for this. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to his wife. "Is he reading that?" But there was no sheet music, no pages on the stand. Curtis's eyes were still closed, his small body swaying slightly, completely absorbed in the world he was creating. This was improvisation. No, not improvisation exactly. This was composition happening in real time, a piece that had been growing in Curtis's mind for 3 years, waiting for this exact moment to emerge fully formed. The melody evolved, organic and inevitable. Curtis introduced a new theme in the middle register, simpler than what had come before, almost childlike in its directness, but then he began to develop it, transforming it through variation. The theme appeared in different octaves, different rhythms, different harmonic contexts. Each time it returned, it meant something slightly different. This was what composers did. Real composers. The ones whose names appeared in concert halls and on recordings. Sebastian Patrick felt his worldview cracking like ice under unexpected weight. He'd been so certain. Talent was obvious. Excellence announced itself. Winners revealed themselves immediately. He'd built an empire on that certainty, made a fortune trusting his ability to recognize quality at first glance. But here was a child he'd dismissed as obviously mediocre, obviously limited, obviously not worth serious attention. And that child was producing music that Patrick, who'd attended hundreds of performances at Symphony Center, who owned a box at the Lyric Opera, who'd sat through countless gala concerts, could not dismiss, could not ignore, could not explain away. The other adults in the room were experiencing their own reckonings. Mrs. Hartley's hand had moved from her mouth to her chest, pressing hard, as if trying to calm her racing heart. She'd spent months teaching Curtis, months watching him struggle through basic pieces, months assuming she understood what she was seeing. How had she missed this? Victoria Chen's eyes were wet. She was thinking about the file she'd read, about Curtis's 3 years in the system, about all the people who'd looked at him and seen nothing special. She was thinking about her own words to Sebastian. Performance anxiety, as if anxiety explained everything, as if the problem was Curtis's fear rather than everyone else's blindness. Margaret Chen, who had been ready to leave 10 minutes ago, was completely still. She recognized something in Curtis's music that she hadn't heard in years, not since her own childhood, when music had been about feeling rather than achievement. When playing piano had meant expressing things she couldn't say with words, before it became about grades and competitions and scholarships. She'd forgotten that version of music existed. Curtis was reminding her. In the line of children, something irreversible was happening. Caitlin's perfect posture had collapsed entirely. She stood slumped, violin hanging loose, face showing the kind of raw emotion she'd been trained to suppress. All those hours of practice, all that technical precision, all those compliments about being so dedicated and very precise, and none of it meant what she'd thought it meant. Curtis, who she'd ignored as obviously beneath her, who'd never played anything impressive in rehearsal, who'd seemed like he barely belonged in the music program at all, was producing something she'd never be able to create. Not because he had better training or more expensive lessons or more natural talent, but because he understood something she didn't. He understood what music was for. Robin had tears running down his face now, completely unconscious of them. His bold, brassy confidence had evaporated. He was just a boy watching someone speak a language he desperately wanted to learn. His trumpet playing was loud because he thought volume equaled importance. Curtis's playing was soft, and it commanded more attention than Robin had ever managed to generate. The lesson was devastating and beautiful at the same time. Abel and Paul had separated. Not physically, but the invisible connection between them had loosened. They were each listening as individuals now, processing this alone. Their careful synchronization, their ability to move as one unit, suddenly seemed like a limitation rather than a strength. Curtis played like one person containing multitudes. The twins played like two people trying to be one. Gerald stood with tears streaming openly, making no attempt to hide them. He recognized what Curtis had done because Gerald had almost done it himself, almost allowed himself to play with real feeling instead of perfect memorization. But fear had stopped him. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of showing too much of himself. Curtis had shown everything. Thomas Brennan leaned over to Margaret Chen. "Do you know what we're listening to?" "I have no idea," she whispered back. "That's a fully realized composition. Original. Sophisticated. That child is working with concepts most adult composers struggle with. Tension and resolution, thematic development, harmonic innovation. And he's doing it without sheet music, without hesitation, like he's been carrying this piece inside him fully formed. How is that possible? I don't know. Thomas shook his head slowly. But I know what we're supposed to do about it. Sebastian Patrick heard their whispered conversation, felt it land like an indictment. The adoption offer he'd made, cruel generosity, test masquerading as kindness, suddenly revealed itself for what it actually was. Not honest evaluation, not tough love, just arrogance, assuming it understood everything at a glance. Curtis had been in front of him all day, small, quiet, easily dismissed, and Patrick had looked right at him and seen nothing, because Patrick had been looking for the wrong things, looking for loudness instead of depth, flash instead of substance, immediate impressiveness instead of patient mastery. The music built toward something now. Curtis's hands moved faster, covering more of the keyboard, but the piece never felt rushed. It felt inevitable, like water finding its level, like truth finally getting its chance to speak. The melody from the beginning returned, transformed now. What had started as a simple, hesitant question had become a statement, not aggressive, not demanding attention, just clear, undeniable. This is who I am. This is what I carry. This is what you missed because you weren't really looking. Mrs. Hartley was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. She'd spent her career believing she could recognize talent, believing she was helping children by giving attention to the obvious ones, the ones who performed well in rehearsal, the ones who seemed naturally gifted. She'd helped some of them, yes. But how many others had she overlooked? How many Curtises had sat quietly in her classes, playing badly on purpose or struggling against their own fears, while she focused elsewhere? The question would haunt her for years. Curtis approached the final movement now. Everyone in the room could feel it, the music gathering itself, preparing for resolution. The themes he'd introduced throughout the piece, Pianist, began to weave together, appearing simultaneously in different registers, having their final conversation. No one wanted him to stop. Patrick's hands were shaking slightly. He'd pressed them flat against his sides, trying to control the tremor, trying to control the feeling rising in his chest that felt dangerously close to shame. In the back row, someone's phone buzzed. No one looked. No one moved. The outside world had become irrelevant. There was only Curtis now. Curtis and the truth he was telling with his small hands on ivory keys. The truth about what happens when you're invisible for so long that you learn to see everything. When you're silent for so long that you learn to hear what others miss. When you're dismissed so consistently that you stop trying to prove yourself to anyone but yourself. The music climbed higher, building to something that felt both joyful and heartbreaking at once, like the moment you realize you've survived something you weren't sure you'd survive. Like the moment you decide to be seen, knowing it might destroy you, but knowing invisibility is destroying you anyway. Curtis's hands moved with absolute certainty now. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just pure expression. And every person in that room understood they were witnessing something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. The moment genius stopped hiding. The final note hung in the air like a held breath. Curtis's hands lifted slowly from the keys, hovering just above them as if he was afraid the sound might shatter if he moved too quickly. His eyes opened, dark, clear, completely present, and he looked down at his small fingers like he was seeing them for the first time. The note faded, died, disappeared into the elegant silence of the music hall. And then, Nothing. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, each moment heavier than the last. Not the empty silence that follows a mediocre performance, but the sacred kind. The silence that happens when something true has been said, and everyone needs a moment to understand what they've heard. Curtis sat perfectly still on the bench, his feet still not quite reaching the pedals, his frayed sweater sleeves pushed up to his elbows. Waiting? He'd been waiting his whole life. He could wait a little longer. In the third row, Thomas Brennan's hands moved first. He brought them together once. Twice. The sound of his applause cracked through the silence like breaking glass. Then his wife joined him. Then Margaret Chen, standing, her expensive dress rustling as she rose. Then someone else, and another. And suddenly the entire room was on its feet, applause building from scattered claps to a roar that filled every corner of the hall. Not polite applause, not the kind that says, "Good job, you tried," but the real thing, the kind that happens when people have witnessed something that changed them, and they need some way to release what they're feeling. Mrs. Hartley was sobbing, her hands pressed to her face, shoulders shaking. Victoria Chen stood with tears streaming down her cheeks, applauding so hard her palms stung. Margaret was saying something extraordinary or incredible, but her voice was lost in the noise. The children in the line had broken formation entirely. Robin was applauding with his trumpet still in one hand, making awkward clanging sounds as the instrument knocked against his leg. Caitlin had set down her violin carefully. Even now, even in this moment, she couldn't quite abandon her training, and was clapping with her face wet, mascara running in dark tracks. Gerald had moved forward without thinking, stopping just a few feet from the piano, his hands together but motionless, just staring at Curtis with an expression that mixed pride and grief in equal measure. Sebastian Patrick stood frozen. His hands hung at his sides, useless. The applause crashed around him like waves, but he couldn't join it. Couldn't move. Couldn't do anything but stand there feeling the foundation of his certainty crack and crumble beneath him. The ovation continued. 30 seconds, 45, showing no signs of stopping. People were calling out now. "Bravo! Beautiful!" Someone in the back was actually weeping audibly. Curtis remained on the bench, his hands now folded in his lap, his head slightly bowed. Not false modesty, real discomfort. This attention, this visibility, was exactly what he'd been avoiding for 3 years. But he'd chosen it. He'd chosen this moment. And now he had to live inside it. Finally, gradually, the applause began to fade. People sat down, reluctant, still murmuring to each other. Thomas Brennan was already talking rapidly to Margaret about scholarships, programs, teachers Curtis should meet. Mrs. Hartley was trying to compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue Victoria had handed her. The room settled into a new kind of silence. Expectant, waiting to see what would happen next. Sebastian Patrick found his voice, though it emerged rougher than he intended. "Curtis," the boy looked up, met his eyes directly for the first time all afternoon. "What?" Patrick paused, swallowed. "What was that piece called?" The room went quiet again, listening. Curtis thought for a moment. His voice when he spoke was soft but clear, the voice of someone who'd spent years saying nothing and had learned to make words count when he finally used them. "It doesn't have a name," he said. "It's just what it feels like to wait." The words landed like a physical blow. To wait. To be invisible. To carry something precious inside you that no one thinks to ask about. To sit in rehearsals and play badly on purpose because being overlooked is safer than being seen and found wanting. To exist in a world where adults look right through you because they've already decided what you are. Patrick felt something crack in his chest. Not his heart. That was too poetic, too simple. Something deeper. The edifice he'd built his entire adult life around. The certainty that he understood how the world worked. That he could see clearly. That his success proved his perception was sharper than other people's. Curtis had just played 3 years of waiting. 3 years of being nobody's first choice. 3 years of watching other children get noticed, get praised, get chosen, while he sat quietly in corners and made himself small. And Patrick had looked at him that morning and thought, least talent. Had looked at him an hour ago and thought, let's get this over with. Had offered adoption like a prize Curtis should be grateful for. Contingent on impressing a man who'd already decided he was unimpressive. Victoria was watching him, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes knowing. She'd tried to warn him. She'd touched his arm, urged caution, suggested maybe this wasn't the approach to take. He'd ignored her because he'd been so certain. Margaret Chen was watching too, and her expression wasn't neutral at all. It was evaluating, measuring, seeing something in Sebastian Patrick she perhaps hadn't seen before, or perhaps had seen and chosen to ignore until now. The other children had moved closer to Curtis, forming an unconscious protective circle. Even Caitlin, even through her own complicated feelings, had moved to stand with him rather than apart. They recognized what had just happened, even if they couldn't articulate it. Curtis had done something they'd all been too afraid to do. He'd told the truth. Patrick stepped closer to the piano. His legs felt unsteady, like he'd been standing too long, though he'd only been standing for 20 minutes. It felt like longer. It felt like his entire life had just been recontextualized in the span of one performance. "Curtis," he said again, and this time his voice was softer, uncertain in a way Sebastian Patrick's voice never was. That was... He couldn't find words adequate to what he'd heard. That was extraordinary. Curtis watched him with those dark, patient eyes, waiting. "You have something I've never..." Patrick stopped, started again. "What you have isn't just talent. It's something else entirely." "Understanding," Thomas Brennan called from the audience. "The boy has understanding. He doesn't just play music, he knows what it's for." Patrick nodded slowly, though the distinction felt important in ways he was only beginning to grasp. The room was watching them now. All of it. 27 adults who'd come here expecting a pleasant afternoon of charitable feelings and tax-deductible donations. 7 children who'd come expecting to be judged and found wanting in different measures. Everyone waiting to see what Sebastian Patrick would do with the trap he'd set for himself. Curtis spoke again, his voice still quiet, but somehow carrying to every corner of the hall. "You said something earlier, Mr. Patrick." Patrick's throat was dry. "I said a lot of things. You said if I impressed you, you'd adopt me." The words hung there. Simple, factual, devastating. Every eye in the room turned to Sebastian. The offer he'd made so casually, so cruelly, so certain it would never need to be honored, was now waiting for an answer. Victoria had gone very still. Margaret's expression had shifted to something sharper, more attentive. Mrs. Hartley had stopped crying, her tissue pressed to her mouth, eyes wide. Sebastian Patrick, billionaire philanthropist, patron of the arts, man whose name carried more weight than most fortunes, stood in his elegant music hall surrounded by witnesses, and felt the power dynamic he'd constructed so carefully reverse itself completely. He'd meant to prove a point, to demonstrate that talent was obvious, that excellence announced itself, that his perception was reliable. Instead, Curtis had proven something else entirely, that power without wisdom is just cruelty with better funding. That seeing clearly requires humility, not certainty. That sometimes the smallest, quietest person in the room is carrying the most weight. "Yes," Patrick said finally. "I did say that." Curtis held his gaze. "Did you mean it?" The question wasn't challenging, wasn't angry. It was just a question. The same question Curtis had probably asked himself 1,000 times about 1,000 broken promises from adults who said things they didn't mean. And Sebastian Patrick, who'd built an empire on always having the answer, had no idea what to say. The question hung in the air between them. "Did you mean it?" Sebastian Patrick opened his mouth, closed it. The words he needed wouldn't come because every word he could think of was wrong. Every response felt like a performance. And Curtis, who'd just played 3 years of truth, would see through performance immediately. Patrick started, then stopped. He was aware of everyone watching. Margaret Chen with her sharp, evaluating eyes. Victoria with her carefully composed expression that meant she was furious. Thomas Brennan leaning forward like he was watching a crucial experiment. The children standing in their protective circle around Curtis. 27 witnesses to whatever he said next. Curtis stood up from the piano bench. He was so small. How had Patrick not noticed before? How small he was. Not just physically, though he was that too, but small in the way children get when the world has taught them that taking up space is dangerous. "I need to say something," Curtis said, his voice still quiet but steady. "Before you answer." Patrick nodded, not trusting his voice. Curtis looked around the room, at the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble, the expensive chairs, at the adults in their expensive clothes, holding their expensive opinions, at his fellow children from Don Bosco, each carrying their own versions of invisibility. "I don't want to be adopted because you were surprised," Curtis said. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward. "I don't want a home because I did a trick that impressed you. I don't want to be someone's charity case because they finally noticed I existed." His voice was getting stronger, more certain. "I want to be chosen because I was seen, not because I had to prove I was worth seeing." Victoria's hand moved to her mouth. Margaret Chen sat back slowly, her expression shifting into something that looked like pain. Curtis turned back to Patrick, and his dark eyes were absolutely clear. "You looked at me this morning. You looked at me an hour ago. You saw my shoes and my sweater and my—" his voice caught slightly, "my quietness. And you decided you knew everything about me. You decided I had the least talent. You made your offer because you thought it was funny, because you thought there was no chance you'd have to follow through." "Curtis," Mrs. Hartley started, but Curtis shook his head. "It's okay, Mrs. Hartley. It's true." He looked back at Patrick. "You weren't being kind, Mr. Patrick. You were being cruel. You just dressed it up nice enough that you could tell yourself it was something else." The room had gone absolutely silent, the kind of silence that feels dangerous, explosive. Patrick's face had drained of color. He wanted to deny it. Wanted to explain that his intentions had been, but they hadn't been good. That was the truth Curtis was making him face. He'd offered adoption not as genuine care, but as entertainment. as a demonstration of his own magnanimity, as a test he'd designed for Curtis to fail so he could prove his worldview correct. "You said I'd fail," Curtis continued. "You said when I failed, not if, when. I could never come back here. Never show my face at any event you sponsor. You were going to take away the one corner where I felt safe because I couldn't perform for you the way you wanted." Robin stepped forward suddenly, standing beside Curtis. "That's messed up, Mr. Patrick." "Robin," Mrs. Hartley tried again. "No, it is." Robin's voice carried his characteristic boldness, but now it was directed at something that mattered. He made Curtis play like it was a game, like Curtis was entertainment. Caitlin moved next, standing on Curtis's other side. Her perfect posture was back, but this time it wasn't about presentation. It was about taking a stand. "We all heard what you said. We all knew what you meant." The twins stepped forward together. Gerald followed, his face still tear-stained but determined. All 7 children from Don Bosco Youth Center stood in a line, not performing now, not auditioning, just standing together, a united front against the casual cruelty of powerful adults who didn't think their words carried weight. Margaret Chen stood abruptly. "Sebastian," her tone was sharp, cutting. Patrick turned to her, and what he saw in her face made something in his stomach drop. This was Margaret Chen, whose foundation board he sat on, whose opinion controlled funding for half his charitable ventures, whose social circle overlapped entirely with his own. "This child," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the room, "just articulated something I think we all need to hear. The difference between charity and dignity, between giving and seeing." Thomas Brennan stood as well. "That boy has more musical understanding than half the graduate students I teach, and you were going to humiliate him to prove a point about what exactly? That poor children should be grateful for whatever scraps the wealthy toss them?" "That's not—" Patrick started, but Thomas cut him off. "That's exactly what it was. You made an offer you never intended to honor. You set up a test designed for him to fail. And when he didn't fail, when he revealed himself to be extraordinary, you're standing there trying to figure out how to save face instead of acknowledging what you did." The audience was splitting. Patrick could see it happening in real time. Some faces showed discomfort. They'd laughed at his jokes earlier, enjoyed the spectacle he'd created. They were seeing themselves implicated now. Others showed anger, judgment, the dawning recognition that they'd witnessed something uglier than they'd realized. Victoria stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice was colder than Patrick had ever heard it. "I told you this morning to approach this differently. I told you these children had experienced real trauma. You said, and I quote, 'These events create opportunity. Everyone wins.'" She looked at Curtis, at his scuffed shoes and frayed sweater, at his small hands that had just produced something transcendent. "Does this look like winning to you, Sebastian?" Patrick felt the room tilting. His reputation, built over decades, carefully maintained, worth more than money, was cracking. And not because of what Curtis had done, but because of what Patrick had done. What he'd revealed about himself in that casual, cruel offer. Mrs. Hartley found her voice, and it shook with emotion. "I failed Curtis too. I looked at him every day in rehearsal and saw struggle instead of strategy. Saw limitation instead of someone protecting himself. I'm as guilty as anyone." She looked at Patrick directly. "But at least I'm willing to admit it." The other children were still standing with Curtis, their solidarity absolute. Caitlin had taken his hand. Gerald stood so close, their shoulders touched. Even Robin, who'd spent the year competing with everyone for attention, had positioned himself protectively. They understood what the adults were still learning. Curtis hadn't just played a piece of music. He'd exposed something, shown them all a mirror they'd been carefully avoiding. Curtis looked at Patrick, and his expression wasn't triumphant. It was just tired, the tiredness of a child who'd had to be too old too soon. "I've been waiting my whole life for someone to really see me, Mr. Patrick. Not see what I could do for them, not see what I could prove. Just see me?" He gestured around the elegant room. "You have all this. You have money and power, and people listen when you talk. And you used it to make a joke out of a kid who has nothing, because you thought that's what power was for." Patrick's hands were trembling now. He'd faced down hostile takeovers, aggressive negotiations, boardroom confrontations. He'd built his fortune by never showing weakness, never admitting error, never backing down. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was a 10-year-old boy teaching him something fundamental about what it meant to be human. "So I'll ask you again," Curtis said softly. "Did you mean it? Because if you did, if somewhere under all that cruelty there was actually a genuine offer, then you need to understand something." The room held its breath. "I don't want to be your redemption story. I don't want to be the poor kid who got saved by the rich man and now everything's okay. I want to be Curtis, just Curtis, the kid who listens to the world and turns it into music. The kid who's been at Don Bosco for 3 years and will probably be there for more. The kid who's scared and angry and tired, but who's still here, still trying." His voice broke slightly. "I want to be chosen for who I am, not for what I proved I could be when you finally paid attention." The silence that followed was absolute. Sebastian Patrick stood in his elegant music hall, surrounded by his expensive things and his carefully cultivated reputation, and understood that he was being offered something more valuable than he'd ever owned. A choice. A real one. He could save face, make excuses, and find some way to spin this into something palatable, protect his image and his pride, and walk away with his worldview intact. Or he could do something he hadn't done in decades. He could admit he was wrong. Curtis watched him, waiting with that infinite patience children learn when adults have failed them too many times to count. The other children stood with him. The adults watched, judging, measuring, seeing what kind of man Sebastian Patrick actually was beneath the expensive suit and silver hair. Everyone waiting to see if power could learn humility, if wealth could recognize its own poverty, if a man who'd built everything on being right could find the courage to be wrong. Sebastian Patrick took a breath, then another. The room waited, 27 adults, 7 children, all holding the same question, all wondering if a man who'd spent decades being certain could find his way to honest uncertainty. "No," Patrick said finally. "I didn't mean it." The words fell like a confession, like the first true thing he'd said all day. "I made that offer because I thought it was clever. Because I thought you'd fail, and it would prove what I already believed about talent and class, and who deserves what in this world." His voice was rough, stripped of its usual polish. "I looked at you, and I saw everything I used to be afraid of becoming. Small, poor, invisible. And instead of feeling compassion, I felt—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Contempt?" Curtis finished quietly. "You felt contempt." Yeah. The admission cost him something. Patrick could feel it in his chest, in his throat. "I'm sorry, Curtis. I'm sorry to all of you. What I did was cruel. What I said was worse, and the fact that I didn't even realize how cruel it was until you made me see it, that's the most damning thing of all." The silence that followed was different from before. Not explosive, not waiting, just present. The silence of something ending and something else not yet begun. Curtis nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." "It doesn't fix anything," Patrick said. "No," Curtis agreed. "It doesn't." Margaret Chen stood again, and when she spoke, her voice had shifted from judgment to something more complicated. "But it's a beginning, Sebastian. If you mean it, if this isn't just damage control." Patrick looked at her, then at Victoria, then at Curtis, standing small and steady with his friends around him. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what you need." "Then maybe," Victoria said quietly, "you should ask instead of assuming." 6 months later. The piano arrived at Don Bosco Youth Center on a Tuesday in March. Not a new one. Patrick had learned that lesson at least. New things in old buildings felt like statements. Like rich people imposing their vision of what poor people needed. Instead, he'd worked with Victoria and Mrs. Hartley to find a refurbished Steinway from a conservatory that was upgrading its equipment. Still beautiful, still worthy. But with a history, with wear, with the understanding that valuable things could show their age. Curtis watched from the window as the movers carefully navigated it through the doors. He didn't rush down, didn't need to claim it immediately. He just watched, patient as always, and felt something settle in his chest. Patrick came every other Thursday now, not with press, not with photographers, just himself, Victoria, and sometimes Thomas Brennan, who'd started teaching a weekly class in composition theory. They'd converted one of the unused classrooms into a proper music studio. Soundproofing, equipment, space for children to create without performing for anyone. Curtis used it sometimes, late at night when the building settled into its familiar rhythms, but now other children used it too. Robin, working on his technique with a patience he'd never shown before. Caitlin, trying to unlearn her perfect posture and find actual feeling in her playing. Gerald, composing his first original piece, something about his grandmother, about Sunday visits and hope deferred, but not destroyed. The hierarchy that had defined Don Bosco's music program had dissolved. Not because someone had dismantled it deliberately, but because Curtis had shown them all something more important than ranking. He'd shown them that music was listening before it was playing, that mastery wasn't about impressing others, but about telling truth. That the quietest voice could carry the most weight if anyone bothered to hear it. 1 year later, Curtis performed at Symphony Center in October. Not a full concert. He was 11 now, still growing, still learning. But Thomas had arranged for him to play one piece as part of a showcase of young composers. Curtis chose the piece he'd played at the music hall, though he'd refined it now, given it structure. A name, finally. Waiting Room. Patrick sat in the audience with Victoria and Margaret. He'd offered to host a reception afterward, rent out a space, invite important people. Curtis had politely declined. "I just want to play," he'd said. "That's enough." Patrick had nodded, understanding now that enough was something he'd never learned to recognize. That his constant need for more money, more power, more recognition, had blinded him to the sufficiency of simple things done well. The performance was 17 minutes long. Curtis played with the same quiet intensity he'd shown that first time, but with more confidence now. Less fear of being seen. The audience listened with the kind of attention that comes when people know they're hearing something real. When he finished, the applause was warm, but not overwhelming. Curtis preferred it that way. He bowed briefly, glanced toward where Mrs. Hartley sat weeping proudly in the third row, and walked off stage. Afterward, in the lobby, a woman approached him. She was elegant, well-dressed, holding a program. "That was extraordinary," she said. "How long have you been composing?" Curtis thought about it. About the 3 years at Don Bosco before anyone knew. About the years before that, learning from his mother before the accident. About all the time spent listening when others were talking. "A while," he said simply. The woman smiled, handed him her card. She ran a youth music program. Real funding. Real opportunities. Curtis took the card politely, thanked her, and put it in his pocket. Later, he'd look at it. Later, he'd consider what it might mean. But right now, in this moment, he just wanted to stand in the lobby and feel what it felt like to have played honestly and been heard. That was enough. 2 years later. Patrick's foundation had changed. Not the name. That would have been performative, another way of making it about him, but the structure, the philosophy. Instead of one-time showcase events, they funded sustained programs, hired social workers who understood trauma, created mentorship programs that lasted years, not afternoons. Victoria ran most of it now. Patrick had learned to step back, to listen to people who actually understood need instead of just writing checks and assuming money fixed everything. He still came to Don Bosco every other Thursday. Still awkward, still learning, still carrying the weight of that afternoon when a 10-year-old boy had taught him what he'd spent 60 years refusing to see. Curtis was 13 now, taller, though still quiet, still listening more than he spoke. He'd been accepted to the Chicago Academy of Arts on full scholarship, not because of his performance at Symphony Center, but because he'd submitted a portfolio of 12 original compositions, each one a different exploration of waiting, watching, learning to be seen. He still lived at Don Bosco, his choice. The Academy had offered housing, but Curtis preferred his bed in the boys' dormitory. Preferred the sounds of the building at night. The rhythms he'd spent years translating into music. "You could leave," Gerald had said once. Gerald had left 6 months ago. His grandmother had finally gotten custody back. But he still visited, still played piano in the converted studio. "You've got opportunities now, real ones." "I know," Curtis had said, "but this is still home. Maybe it won't always be. But right now, it's where I need to be." Gerald had nodded, understanding. Some children left Don Bosco running, trying to escape what it represented. Others left when they were ready, when the leaving felt like choice instead of escape. Curtis was waiting to feel ready, and he'd learned he was good at waiting. 3 years later, the music hall was full again. Not for a showcase, not for donors, for a benefit concert Curtis had organized with Thomas Brennan's help. All the performers were current or former youth center children. Some were brilliant. Some were still learning. All of them played with the understanding that music was truth-telling, not performance. Curtis played last, by choice this time, not cruelty. He'd written a new piece, Scene. It was about transformation, about the moment invisibility becomes choice instead of survival strategy, about understanding that being overlooked had taught him to see clearly, that waiting had taught him patience, that struggling had taught him how to help others struggle less. Sebastian Patrick sat in the audience, farther back this time, not demanding front-row recognition. He'd learned that support didn't require proximity, that helping meant stepping aside sometimes and letting others take the light. When Curtis finished, Patrick didn't rush to congratulate him, didn't need to claim credit or connection. He just sat in his seat and watched Curtis be surrounded by friends, by teachers who actually saw him, by a community he'd helped create, not through one impressive performance, but through years of showing up, listening, telling the truth. Victoria leaned over. "You did good work here, Sebastian." Patrick shook his head. "Curtis did the work. I just finally got out of the way."